Yay, first day of Ruby.
Yay.
And I always wear a Ruby related shirt on
Yeah,
the first day
that's
of Ruby. of some. Yeah, I can't find these anymore. I love this shirt. I can't find it anymore. So I always try and wear a Ruby shirt on the first day of Ruby.
We'll have to do a hackathon and make shirts for it. So
Yeah, there used to be a Ruby Tees site that had like all like Ruby related T-shirts.
That's cool.
Um,
Redbubble has stuff that
yeah. Yeah, but somebody literally had a site that was just Ruby T-shirts, and it was awesome. And they had a lot of good ones, but it's gone.
I'll be shopping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I thought about that.
right. So you're gonna find a lot of similarities from Ruby to JavaScript. It's kind of in that way we deal with Ruby, right? So our Ruby files, unlike our JavaScript files, are gonna end in .rb. But since we don't run our Ruby code in the browser like we did with JavaScript, we have to run them from the terminal. So when we run our Ruby code, we're going to be doing things like Ruby space and the name of our file .rb from the terminal. I will also show you how to set up your computer to run your Ruby code from inside of VS Code. I don't yet know how to do that for our Windows users, but I will continue to look at it. I can help the Mac folks get that set up. But at a minimum, we can run our Ruby code by saying Ruby space and the name of the file. We can get an interactive console kind of like the developer tools with a program called IRB, which stands for Interactive Ruby. And we're going to spend a lot of time in our Ruby work in something like IRB. When we move on to using Rails, we're going to have another version of IRB called something else, but it's all kind of the same thing. So Ruby space file name is kind of like, yarn start, and IRB is kind of like your developer tools web console window. And our files end in RB instead of ending in JS. And hopefully you'll see through this that there's going to be a strong similarity in kind of the language style between Ruby and JavaScript. Cool. How's your setups going? Okay? Still flowing? Okay, cool. So let's talk about strings. Right? Let's talk about variables and basic types, right? We've been through JavaScript. We've done strings and numbers and arrays and objects in JavaScript. Let's see what those look like in Ruby.
I could type out the URL, but could you?
The shortcut. Yeah, the handle shortcut.
Because it doesn't follow like if you just remove one end and add another end, it doesn't sound.
Yeah, it's in the curriculum backend, full stack. Lecture series Ruby, but that's the direct link.
Thank you.
Cool. So let's do this. Let's do this in IRB. So for those of you who have Ruby follow along, if you want to follow along, you can start a terminal, and from anywhere, you can run the tool IRB. Now your IRB may look a little bit different than mine because I have some extra fancy stuff configured in my IRB. If yours looks different than mine, then maybe in lab time this afternoon, I will help you get set up with some of the same fancy things you see in my terminal. But what you should see is some kind of prompt, right, in your cursor blinking. You don't have to follow along if you don't want to. If you'd like to, yes. For those who are still getting their computer set up, you can catch up and try these things later. But we're kind of in the same thing here that you're familiar with from here, right? This JavaScript console here, right? You're in your developer tools. That's the same idea here, right? This is an interactive JavaScript console. This is an interactive Ruby console, right? We can type things like here, right? And it lets us type something and get an answer back. We're going to see the same thing in IRB.
So you just put in IRB and that's it?
IRB and enter. Yep.
Okay, I'm getting an error that says no such file or directory? Bad interpreter.
Then your computer isn't totally set up correctly, and we will fix that later.
Yay!
Yeah, so yay, we ran into a problem.
Right, no problem.
We will fix that later. Yeah,
Alright.
that might be an indication that we will eventually remove RBNs.
So should
Cool.
I get started?
No, please don't.
Okay.
I will do that with you. Yeah. So don't worry about following along. We'll fix that
Okay.
on break or in lab time.
Alright.
Right. So here's a JavaScript making a variable for a string. Right. In JavaScript, you might do something like let name equal to Gavin, right? Or even const name equals to Gavin. But we type some line of code in and we see a response in our interactive console. We see the same thing here in IRB, and in fact, the syntax is identical without the let statement. So Ruby doesn't have the idea of let or const for variable names. We just have variable names. So this statement is the same idea in JavaScript that it is in Ruby, right? We've made a variable called name and we've given it the value Gavin. And our interactive Ruby is printing out the value of the last statement that it executed, right? So we made name equal to Gavin. The value of that statement is the string Gavin. So variable assignment should look very familiar to you between JavaScript and Ruby, except for the word let goes away. Just like in JavaScript, our objects, our variables, have methods we can call and ask them questions. We can ask for name.length. But a little bit differently than JavaScript, you'll notice that we tend not to put parentheses at the end. So we've all seen this in JavaScript, right? 2 uppercase parentheses. In Ruby, the method is called upcase, but notice we don't have the parentheses. This is because in Ruby, the parentheses are optional. You can put them in if you like. You can leave them out if you don't want them. This is one of these things where Ruby starts to feel a little bit more English-like because we get rid of some of the extraneous syntax that we don't need. Right? We'll see there are some cases where we do need the parentheses and where we will use the parentheses, but for the most part, Ruby is to leave them out. One of the places where we will use parentheses if we're passing values to that method, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Right? So that's kind of a nice thing, right? We don't have to put the parentheses there. We also have string interpolation like we do in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, we've done something like this. Backtick, hello, name, like this. In Ruby, our interpolation works a little differently. So let's make a new string variable and say my score is 41 plus 1. So there's a couple things here that's a little bit different than JavaScript. One is the naming of our variables. So by convention, we use snake case. Underscores separate words. New string, new underscore string. Where in JavaScript, we may have chosen this variable. Right? This will work, no problems. But other Rubyists will be like, you're not kind of following the rules of this community, right? These are community enforced rules, not language enforced rules. So you want to walk like a Rubyist, talk like a Rubyist, it's snake case, new underscore strings. I will point out places where capitalization does matter, because there are a couple of those, but this is the way. And then you'll notice that instead of the $ for interpolation, we use the octothorpe, the hash mark. I just like saying octothorpe.
Yeah. I like that you keep saying that.
Yeah. There's a, if you ever listen to the podcast 99% Invisible, they have a whole episode about the octothorpe. It's really interesting. Right? So the octothorpe there and the mustache braces imply the string interpolation. So we do this, we get my score is 42. So the same rules about JavaScript inside of those braces work there with Ruby. I can say my name is name. And I get my name is Gavin. So very similar to JavaScript string interpolation. Not JSX, but go all the way back to kind of week 1 stuff with string interpolation in JavaScript.
Do you not need the quotation marks? Since notice you missed one. For name.
Yeah, so this starts the string, that ends the string,
okay, yeah.
and then name is here. Now, we do remember in JavaScript that we could say something like my name is Gavin and my score is 42, right? That we could do this, or in JavaScript we could do this, right? We talked about single quotes and double quotes, and we're like, they're equivalent. Well, guess what? They're equivalent in Ruby too.
It's in stars, so should I start IRB?
No, let's on the half-hour break.
Yeah.
We'll finish up those last steps just to make sure you're okay. Mm-hmm. So in Ruby, our single quotes and our double quotes are almost exactly the same. There's one tiny little difference between single quotes and double quotes in Ruby. So if I do this with my string interpolation, my name is name and my score is 41 plus 1. I'm going to shrink the font down a little bit so it all fits on one line. That works great. If I use single quotes, it does not do the string interpolation. So single quotes and double quotes in Ruby are exactly the same, except single quotes will not do string interpolation. So this means that most of the time as Rubyists we tend to write double quotes. But you can really do either. You just have to remember that if you're doing string interpolation and you like to type single quotes, then it won't do it. But most Rubyists, I think, just do the double quotes. So if you just do double quotes, then there's nothing to remember. Just remember, if you ever see code with single quotes, it means it just won't do string interpolation. That's totally fine. Okay. So let's talk about numbers. So instead of doing that, 41 plus 1, we can just assign a number. Okay. We can do math on numbers just like we did in JavaScript.
I'm wondering, just the last part where you did the 42 plus 1, would that work, the arithmetic work, if you did, say, just instead of displaying the brackets using parentheses?
Here.
Yeah, would it say without the hash, would you be able to just run 41 plus 1 in parentheses?
Here, no.
Yeah, so you have to.
Yeah, this is what says what's inside of here. Treat it like a Ruby statement. So everything inside of these not for the singles. Everything inside of these hash mark, octothorpe, curly braces means execute this as Ruby.
Okay.
If I had left this out, it would literally say 41 plus 1. Even if I put these around it, it isn't until I get this whole pattern that I get the evaluation.
Cool.
Yeah.
So parentheses won't do anything.
Yeah. These won't do anything either.
What if we use a $sign?
You'll just literally get a $sign. Yeah. So just remember that $sign braces in JavaScript is hash mark braces in Ruby. I wish it was more consistent, but it isn't. Because everyone makes their own language choice. Right. So we can take numbers and we can do some math on them. But this doesn't work. Our little plus plus from JavaScript, we don't get that in Ruby. But we get something a little different. So in JavaScript, I think we've all seen, right, score equals 42, and if you do score plus plus, right, score becomes 43. Right, but what if we wanted to increment score by 2? Right, we can't do like plus 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 plus, right? We do plus equals 2. Right, we get 45. right? Well, we always could have done this, score plus equals 1. That plus plus is just a shortcut. So we don't have the plus plus in Ruby, but we do have plus equals 1. So if you're used to plus plus, just know in Ruby it's plus equals and how much you want to plus equal something. So plus equals 1, plus equals 1. But we can also do 2. We can do 10. So that's the equivalent of plus plus in Ruby. It's the plus equals that we had in JavaScript. We're just missing the plus plus for the case of adding 1. So so Ruby taketh away, but Ruby also giveth. So numbers in Ruby are more powerful than they are in JavaScript because they are also objects. Right? We talked a little bit about objects, I think, in JavaScript where we have methods, right? Our classes have methods like render in React, right? Or .length for a string. We can ask our number variables questions. Are you even? Are you odd? Are you positive? Are you negative? If we bring in, and we'll talk about libraries later, if we add some more things to Ruby, we can ask them numbers if they're prime numbers. Well, we don't get that by default, but if we ask for the prime standard library, now all of a sudden we can ask if some number is prime. Hey, 42, are you prime? Nope. How about 43? Yep.
What is prime?
A prime number is a number that's only divisible by 1 and itself. So 2 is prime, 3 is prime, 4 isn't prime because it's divisible by 4. 5 is prime, 6 isn't.
Undividable.
It's undividable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are these supposed to work without context? Because there are errors coming up every time I try to type things like that.
What kind of error are you getting?
It's just no method, undefined kind of stuff. And
So if you do 43.odd question mark, does that come back and say true?
odd question mark. Yes. It does.
Okay. So the prime one was because we missed a line.
Oh, okay.
But
All right.
I'm just what I'm more showing you is just that in JavaScript, this is not something we could do.
Yeah.
Because in JavaScript, these numbers are not objects. In Ruby, these numbers are objects, and objects have behavior. And we're going to talk about objects in more depth tomorrow. Right? But this means that we can ask our questions numbers. Sorry, we can ask our numbers questions. Switch that. We can ask our numbers questions, and we can make our numbers do things. Because in Ruby, everything is an object, and that's a very powerful language choice. Right? So the fact that we can ask something as odd rather than do 43 mod 2 equals 1, right? That's how you would have to do it in other languages. Is the remainder when divided by 2 1? That's odd, right? 42.even, right, is essentially asking this question. So numbers are a little more powerful than they have been in the past. We can do more with them. Let's talk about Ruby arrays. Question?
You said that everything in Ruby is an object?
Yes.
Cool.
Everything in Ruby is an object. Even our numbers are objects. Yeah. One of the things is it lets us have really huge numbers. Oh, that big old long number is not odd, right? Here's a side note. This is like, remember I said Ruby tries to make programmers happy? So quickly try and read that number as like a written out number, like 273. To read that out as a big number.
Oh yeah. Okay.
1,223
million.
No.
Million.
12
Are you-
billion.
Yeah, are you sure? So here's the thing, right? It's really hard to see those. Like, don't you wish we could write numbers like this?
Yeah.
Ah.
We can't.
Seems a billion.
We can't, but in Ruby, numbers can have underscores in them, and it ignores them. So you can use the underscore as your placeholder for thousands, millions, billions, etc. So that's really easy to read. That's 123,456,789, right? So if I type this number, right, hard to read. If I type that number, easy to read. So Ruby numbers can have underscores for placeholders.
They can't have commas though.
Can't have commas though. So they decided to use the underscore, and that's kind of the placeholder. Now the thing is, you can be silly and do this, right? So don't just randomly stick underscores in your numbers. But like, hey, if you're typing out a big number, Matt's is like, oh, they're easier to read when we have placeholders in them. So let's let you put underscores in the middle of numbers. A really simple thing for the language to allow us to do, but it makes me a little bit happier than I was before. Does it change my life? No. But if I'm looking at a code base, right, and it has like, I'm making a banking application and it has like a max bank account size, right? The most we allow somebody to deposit is that 10 billion? Is it 10 trillion? Is it 10 what? I don't know. But if I quickly look at that, it's 100 billion. Really easy to see, right? Little tiny things that make us happy.
Yeah.
That's what I love about Ruby. Cool. You'll find a couple other things I like about Ruby when we're going through this. Let's talk about arrays. Boy, did we use scores equals an array a lot, probably, right? Here's our syntax. It is exactly the same as JavaScript. Variable equals bracket, element, comma, element, comma, element, comma, element. Right? And even scores bracket 0 gives us the first element in our array. So Ruby arrays are also 0 indexed, right? Just like JavaScript arrays. Hey.
That is a brilliant way to do that.
I know,
Yeah.
right? I was like,
That's
everyone's
really
got their
good.
own space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're just gonna check to see like how warm the projector makes that
I will
spot.
wear a sweater next time.
Yeah. Yeah. And we wore sweaters today because we thought we were gonna be out in the big space, not in the back space. But it is
The Ruby
nice in
tin.
here.
Cozy.
Yeah.
I'm gonna put that on my
Also
list.
known as previously as Catherine's office.
Yeah.
Before that, it was basically when you had 8 students in here.
Yes.
Yeah, you told us
It was
that.
like sardines.
Yeah.
Aw.
And it got a little toasty in here.
It did.
Yeah.
Yeah. Body heat and all that.
We actually closed up most of the other vents along this
Just
so that it would
get
force more cold air.
But yeah, that's what we were saying, because we were like warm-bodied people and we get heat
Yeah.
heat a lot, so
Yeah.
no one
So.
that.
Yeah. 5 in here's not bad. Yeah. So we're doing first day of Ruby.
Yeah.
And I always wear a Ruby shirt on the first day.
Yeah. We
So-
need Ruby shirts.
I'm
We
wearing
need look
nothing
good.
shirt today.
Aww.
Aww.
You have to show the solidarity.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Ruby. Cool. Right, so yeah, Ruby arrays are 0 index just like all good languages are, right? Actually, most languages are, right? So we can ask for, let's see, the 0, 1. We can ask for the first element, the second element, the third element, right? But Ruby's a nice language, so I can ask for the first element, and I can ask for the last element. Right? These are little things that the Ruby Standard Library gives us that tries to make it a little more accessible, a little more English-like, a little bit easier to process.
Last is really nice because usually you don't know how long the array is.
Yeah.
Right.
You gotta
Right.
write extra stuff.
Yeah. In JavaScript, this would be scores.length -1. Right? How long is the array? Subtract 1 because we're 0 based. Ask for that index. I don't know, scores.last is really cool.
Yeah.
So let's try this something in JavaScript here real quick. Just to give you some examples, right? Scores equals, oops, no, that's not what I want. I want this.
Just those scores.
Yeah, I want to use the same one, right? So right, we know that this works. What is this going to be? Oh, it tells me. In JavaScript, do we say scores -1? We get undefined. In Ruby, what do we get? The last element. So Ruby indexes that go this way wrap around. So scores minus 1 is the last element. What do you think this is going to be?
42.
Second.
Yeah, it's the second to last element of the array.
Oh, cool.
Scores minus 3 is the third from last element of the array. Awesome. Little tiny things that make us happy.
Right.
So if this is scores, what do you think scores of 43 is here? Here's our scores.
Okay.
Scores bracket 43 is going to be
40.
undefined. Yeah, we went off the end of the array. In Ruby, we get back nil.
Okay.
If it can't figure out what that index is from the array, it gives us back nil. I'm sorry, I couldn't figure that out. Like, hey, the negative stuff works, but if we go past the end of the array to the right, we're into no person's land, and we get a nil.
What does it stand for?
Is that
What does it stand for?
nil for nothing?
No.
So nil, null, none.
Well, nan is different.
Yes.
But nil and null in JavaScript and Ruby are the same.
Bunny.
JavaScript also though has undefined
Uh-huh.
and nan, which
Yeah.
are like, they're all things that have related meanings, but there's like subtle semantic differences.
Okay.
Yeah, we found this yesterday.
Right, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. That's it.
There is zero toilet paper. There is no toilet paper. That is not toilet paper.
That's it.
I'm glad they put a bunny.
And undefined would be like, there's not even a toilet paper holder there.
Yeah.
You're not even in the bathroom.
Yeah. Yeah. Show like a kitchen. Yeah. So I'm kind of curious. If scores of 43 is off the end, what is scores of minus 43?
That's what I was wondering.
Always.
Yeah. Because minus 1, minus 2, minus 3, minus 4, minus 5, we went off the end to the left. So a little bit of negative will wrap you
Doesn't
around.
keep wrapping.
Doesn't keep wrapping. And I wasn't sure.
I wasn't sure either.
Yeah.
He's like, I've never tried that before.
Yeah.
What would it do?
Yeah.
Because then that would be like doing like mod length.
Yes.
Yeah.
Probably. I'm wondering why they didn't, but I'd be curious to see. Yeah. Right. So scores minus 1 is the last thing. Scores minus 2 is the second to last thing. Returns nil if it isn't there. Right. And length. Right. Just like JavaScript, we can store different kinds of things in our array. Right? There's no restrictions for what we can store in an array, right? Because we are not a strongly typed language like the .NET folks are, sorry, the C# folks are. They cannot do this as easily as we can, right? Their arrays, when they declare them, you saw Mark say, this has to be an array of numbers. This has to be an array of strings, right? There are, like we said when we're doing our comparison, there's nice things about that, and there's some restrictive things about
What
that.
if you expected those all to be numbers?
Right.
There's a string in there. Like,
Yeah.
Oops.
So our code has to be a little bit more defensive if we need it to be, right? Because if our code says, hey, the other programmer is going to send me an array, and I'm going to average those values, I'm going to average those scores. Well, what do we do with JSON? Well, I don't know. What kind of score is that, right? If this was 12, 43, 55, and 100, we could average those numbers. But if all of a sudden there's a string in the middle, we're not sure what to do. In C#, they would be guaranteed those would all be numbers. They don't have to worry about that. So we have to be a little bit more forth-thinking about these things. But there are lots of times where you want your arrays to be a mix of different kinds of things. And Ruby doesn't get in your way in that regard, right? And all the same things work. My array of 0 is JSON. My array of 1 is 43, right?
And then
Our
you can do
indexes.
things like zip that array.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's all kinds of cool things our arrays can do in Ruby. And we're going to get to a bunch of those when we talk about enumerable. Yeah, so our arrays can be of mixed type. So we don't have the object like we do in JavaScript. So we look at our JavaScript. Right, if you think back to JavaScript, you have seen objects that look like right, you can say person.name and person.score. These are JavaScript objects that have properties that we can ask for. In Ruby, what we have is a hash. Some languages call these dictionaries, or a map, and they look like this. So a very similar syntax. We have an open brace that says, hey, this is a hash. And then the keys and the values are separated by this little syntax. Right? We call this the hash rocket, because it kind of looks like if you stood it up this way, right? Might be a rocket blasting off. So the thing to the left is the key, the thing to the right is the value, comma, key, hash rocket value, comma, key, hash rocket value. Right, and this gives us a hash. It's going to work a lot like the object in JavaScript. I even have my console set up to format them really nicely, so I like to be able to read them. I'm a big fan of indentation, so I will show you all how to get your terminal your IRB to format like this. Okay, but if this is our person object, I wish we could do person.name, right, but that doesn't work, unfortunately. But what does work is just like our arrays, and actually just like JavaScript. We don't often talk about this in JavaScript, that we could, instead of doing person.name, we could say person name like this. In JavaScript, person.name and person bracket string name are the same. Right? We often do this because it's easier. In Ruby, the way we look up a key in a hash is with the bracket syntax. It's consistent with arrays, right? But we don't have a position here. We have a key. So if I ask for person name, I get their name. If I ask for person score, I get their score. And if I ask for person favorite color, I get blue. Right? So these two things work pretty much the same. We're going to see a lot of differences between hashes and JavaScript objects, but from the starting point, they're very, very familiar.
Is Ruby an object-oriented language or a functional?
It is an object-oriented language that borrows some functional ideas, but it is purely an object-oriented
Most
language.
programming languages are multi-paradigm.
Yeah.
It's like they can do different styles, but JavaScript is one that's like has object-oriented sort of tacked on as an afterthought, but it's
Yeah.
like more functional in nature.
Yeah.
Ruby is like pure object-oriented. To the
Yeah,
point where like everything is an object
Yeah.
in Ruby.
yeah, and JavaScript is like mostly functional in that it treats functions as first person or first class.
More functional than it is object-oriented, but it's definitely like a multi-paradigm language.
Yes.
And it's not functional like OCaml is functional.
Yeah, there are very few languages that fall strictly in one camp or the other.
Yeah. Most general purpose most useful programming languages are multi-paradigm.
Yeah.
There are some that are like very strict, but they're either more academic or they're very niche.
Yeah.
Okay, and so that, and the common programming languages that we see, none of them are going to be like that.
Like purely one thing
Yeah.
or the other, except for maybe C++, which is
Okay.
probably like
Yeah, but they're getting some functional things.
they are.
And so is Java. Java was always considered like it's purely object oriented, but now they're getting lambdas and
Yeah.
whatnot. So the languages find that they have to leave their purity in order to like more easily solve a broader range of problems.
Because there are problems that are very, very easily solved in a functional style and are very hard to solve in an object-oriented style, and vice versa.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what's the difference, like functional and object oriented?
So functional languages just have functions and plain data types. They just have strings, numbers, arrays, and dictionaries.
Yeah. Well, and usually function.
And function as a data type, yeah. That you can make a function and a variable, right? So in JavaScript we saw, right,
With the hooks.
even like this, even if we say const make me uppercase is a function that takes a name and returns the name to uppercase plus an exclamation mark, right? We saw that make me in uppercase is actually a variable. What does that variable store? It stores a function that if I call the function, it does something. This means that I can make a variable be a function. And that's one of the aspects of a functional language. And we can pass these functions around as if they were the same kinds of variables as strings or numbers. Whatever I'm passing a function or passing a string, JavaScript don't care.
Yeah.
But other languages do. So a non-functional language, typically you can't make functions as variables. They're a different kind of thing. They're treated differently by the language. And we're going to see that in Ruby in just about a minute.
And one of the core differences too, I think, is that object-oriented languages have the idea of taking functions that do a thing and then data that's related to that thing and then grouping them together in what's called a class.
Yeah.
And then those functions, you don't call them functions anymore, you call them methods.
Yeah.
And they work on the data that's related to them.
Yeah.
And that whole idea is grouped together.
Yeah.
And that's what objects are.
Yeah. Well, you saw that in React. Remember we first taught you React with class and state, right? So the class is what makes an object, right? And your state is the data that's bound, wrapped up with that object, right? That version of my hello world component, the instance of it on the page has a specific state, right? Where a different instance of that hello world might have a different state, right? And when we taught you hooks, we said, well, we can't use classes. We're just going to use functions
To solve the same.
to solve the same problem. But what went away was that state variable, right? We have to use useState, right? Which is a function. So in a functional style, there is no data that's bound to that function like that in the same way that data is bound to an object.
It's actually good. So like the class and state stuff that you've been doing in React is an object-oriented style, whereas hooks is a very functional style.
But
Solving
hooks
the same
is
problem.
what people are going to be using anyway. Even
React is moving more.
React
towards,
is
React
moving
has
towards
been
it.
moving more towards the
Yeah.
functional style.
Yeah.
Yeah, and part of the thing is that classes and object-orientedness was bolted onto JavaScript only very recently.
That class syntax that you use in JavaScript, it gets translated into something that's essentially just some function calls.
Yeah, and that syntax is
syntactic sugar.
it's only a couple of years old. I don't remember.
2015.
Yeah,
It's part of the ES 2015, ES6 features.
Yeah.
And most of the time when you're using it, it doesn't even run in the browser as a class. The yarn build step that you're doing is compiling the JavaScript you've written into something that will run on the browser. And when it runs on the browser, it's a call to React.createComponent instead of an actual class.
yeah. Only recently have some of the browsers actually supported the class syntax natively.
Yeah. And even then, like I said, when you run your React stuff, that's not what runs on the browser.
Yeah.
It gets changed
Yeah.
before it does. Because that won't work in older browsers.
Yeah.
So class allows to is like identifying objects.
Mhm.
Set.
Yeah,
Yeah.
class defines so a person that has a property name, like one be Gavin, one be Jason, those individual Gavin Jason ones are objects. They're instances of a class. A class is the blueprint for what a person is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kind of like your components. Like
Yeah.
the code you wrote in your JavaScript file, that was a class, and then once they're live on the page and each one maybe behaves differently and there's multiple instances of the thing you defined, those are the objects. Same.
They're little factories for making objects.
And you'll get more into that in the next couple days.
Yeah. Actually, tomorrow. So kind of like our arrays, right? If I said scores of 43, I got back a nil. What do you think is going to happen if I ask for a person's favorite food?
Undefined.
Yeah, but we call undefined in Ruby. We call that nil.
No.
Yeah. So good thought. Just new terminology, right? So if you ask for a key from a hash that doesn't exist, you get back nil. Right? What happens if we have our person class and we say, comma, favorite roller coaster? I hate roller
I
coasters.
hate roller coasters
I hate roller coasters, so my favorite roller coaster is nil.
too.
Right? So if I say person favorite roller coaster, I get back nil. What's that? Yeah.
See? Oh my god,
Busch Garden.
the worst one though of all.
So how do we know the difference between asking a hash and there being a key whose value is nil and asking a hash for a value for a key that's not there?
Quotation marks?
Yeah, I wish. We can do something like we can ask it, do you have a key called favorite roller coaster? And it will tell us if it's there. Right? We can ask it, hey, before I check, do you even have this key? Right?
That's interesting. It doesn't say null instead of.
Right. Here I'm asking it a question. Hey, person, do you have this key roller coaster? And it's like, yep, I sure have it. So if you ask me for it, I'm going to give you back a value. Whereas here, if I ask person, do you have this key favorite food? It goes, nope. If you ask me, I'm going to give you back nothing. Right? In this case, if I ask for person favorite roller coaster and I get back nil, that's a purposeful nil. In this case, if I ask person for favorite color, the nil means there was nothing there.
When do you ask the questions? Is it like a console.log situation where you're checking?
Yeah, or an if statement in a minute when we get to conditionals. Yeah, we'll ask these questions. We'll do ifs. There's another way to ask a hash for something, and that's using the fetch syntax. So if I fetch my score, I get a 42. If I fetch my name, I get Gavin Stark. If I fetch my favorite roller coaster, I get back nil. If I ask for my favorite food, I think Jason knows this one, I get back what's called an exception or an error.
I don't know.
Right? It tells me you asked me for something, but brr, sorry, there's nothing here. I'm going to give you purposefully an error. And
You didn't
sometimes,
ask, right? You were trying to get stuff.
yes, I was. Please fetch me this value, and Ruby said, no way, Jose,
Yeah.
we're out. We're getting an error. And sometimes getting those errors is good on purpose, right? There's ways to handle errors that we're going to see later on. What's even nicer is the fetch lets us tack on the end here. Nope. Yeah, nope. Don't have one. Right? We can put in parentheses, right, in curly brackets, we can put a default value to return. If you try and fetch favorite food and there isn't one, then inside of the braces here, we can give you a value to return if it's missing.
Did you get that for roller coaster too?
No.
Yeah.
Because I do have a key for a roller coaster, but its value is nil. Yeah. This idea of nil and undefined gets to be pretty tricky. It's tricky in JavaScript. It's also tricky in Ruby because we often use nil to mean there was nothing there. If we ask this and there's no key, we get back a nil, but sometimes we also use nil as the value.
So you can't just leave it blank or put 0 or put no. That is just the way to fill in that you don't have an answer for that.
Yes. Often nil in Ruby is used as there's nothing here.
And you could put an empty string there,
Mhm.
Yeah.
0 or NA or
Yep.
something.
Or
You
no.
could,
You could.
Or you could leave it no.
Mhm.
Oh, okay.
It's
Yeah.
going to be up to programmer style.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So the curly bracket gonna be property for that key.
It's going to be the value to return for this fetch if that key is missing. If I ask this hash for this key and it's missing, I want this value back. So the hashes in Ruby are pretty flexible. They've got a lot of different things we can do with them, which makes them pretty powerful, which is why we see them used all over the place in Ruby. We're going to see lots of hashes everywhere, especially when we get into Rails. When we start using the Rails framework.
While with that block, like set the default value if it wasn't there.
Yes,
And then return the default values, and the next time you call it,
it'll be filled
you
in.
get the default value.
Yeah. Hashes are pretty darn powerful in Ruby. Cool. We can also, I'm gonna fix some of the escaping in here. We can also store more complex values inside of the keys of our hash. So our keys can also be something like an array, right? Instead of just having a person with a single score, we can have a person with multiple scores. So if I ask for person scores, what do you think I get back?
All everything in the room?
Yeah, everything in the array. Exactly. Right? So if this part here is an array, what do you think that's going to give me?
42.
Yeah. Kick ass. Awesome, right? Because person scores is an array, this gives me the second, right? And then everything here still works. I can ask for the last score of this person's scores.
Dot average.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if that's built in.
Is that the active support thing?
But what about sum?
Oh, I need that in my life. For all this
Right.
katas.
Yes.
Yeah.
100 plus 98 plus 42 plus
Wait till
64.
you see how many katas get so easy in Ruby.
Yeah.
Versus like
We,
Right.
20 lines of code in JavaScript.
Yeah.
one
Yeah.
line of code.
well, the one we were doing yesterday that you left after a
Yeah.
while, which was like the digits in reverse. We did it in Ruby. It was
See how many
literally,
lines-
yeah, it was literally num.digits.
I was waiting so long to make that joke.
Yeah.
String it, split it.
Split it.
So funny.
Cool. Let's take a break so we can get our Windows friends' computers up to going. We'll take a little break if they aren't already. And then when we come back, we're going to talk about how we interact with users. How do we print things to the screen and get things from users so we can have our programs be a little bit more dynamic? Because you're going to need it for tonight's homework.